This is Mr. Sharp. Today we're going to continue on with Spotlight New Thinking, and this one will be about Yorktown. It'll be social studies today instead of science. I noticed looking at the journals that you guys turned in, you did pretty good. Mostly threes and like 2.5s. Mostly though, the problem was with this column, responses. I think you need more guidance on this. The book where I get the Reader's Workshop lessons basically just says anything from inner conversation. So, any sort of Reader's Workshop strategy. But if we need to be more specific, I'm going to say don't make your response an answer to the question you ask over here. It needs to be like a second note. So we have our fact. Our first note has to be a question. The second note can be a question, can be this reminds me of, it can be a reaction. But for today, let's say it's not an answer to one of these questions. I think that way we'll get more thinking. You'll see today when I did this, I had to pause. Coming up with a question was pretty easy, but then it's like, Mr. Sharp, you need a second reaction. So you may have to pause and think about it a little bit. As for the questions, we did better with this, but just for today, let's try to write down questions that are not answers, that the answers are not just like in the thing that you're reading. We got some of that yesterday where someone would write a question and then the answer, they'd write the response as an answer and it would just be like the next paragraph from the reading. So let's try to make our questions a little bit bigger than the document we are reading. Okay, that's enough of me talking about just how this document's going to work. Let's look at our text. So today I'm going to read about the American Revolution and the Battle of Yorktown. We are on Dexter's again. The Battle of Yorktown was the last great battle of the American Revolutionary War. It is where the British Army surrendered and the British government began to consider a peace treaty. Build up to the battle. General Nathanael Greene had taken over command of the American Continental Army in the South. Prior to General Greene's command, the war in the South had not been going very well, but Greene put in some new tactics that enabled American victories and caused the British Army to retreat to the East Coast. Okay, so since I have this big picture, that's a good place to stop and say, here's 2 paragraphs. What's the fact that I want to remember? Well, the first part talks about the British surrendering, but I already know that. That's kind of what the Battle of Yorktown is famous for, so I'm not going to make that my note. And then we have General Nathanael Greene was the commander of the Americans in the South. Writing down a guy's name is a fact, but maybe it's not the most important fact in a passage. I did think it was interesting and maybe something worth remembering that before Greene was the commander, that's what prior means, the war in the South had not been going very well for the Americans. So let's make that our note. The Americans didn't do well in the South for a lot of the war. So then I have to write a question that goes with that fact. So I'm going to say, what about the South gave the British an advantage? I could say the same question with something like, what about the South gave the Americans a disadvantage? And then my response, which is not going to be an answer to my question, I've heard that the accent in the South is close to the British accent during the time of the, we'll say Revolutionary War, but I'm just going to abbreviate it as maybe Rev War. Yeah. Okay. So then I want to line up my numbers. And let's go back to the document. We've got a picture here. It's not a graphic like yesterday, so I'm not going to turn that into a note. At the same time that the British Army under General Charles Cornwallis was retreating to Yorktown, General George Washington was marching his army down from the north. The French Navy, having defeated the British Navy, started to move to the coast near Yorktown as well. We have another picture, but I'm going to keep reading because that was a pretty short paragraph. The British army was now surrounded at Yorktown, so the American army is all around the British army. They were greatly outnumbered by the French and American troops. For 11 days, the American forces bombarded the British. Finally, Cornwallis sent out the white flag for surrender. He originally made a lot of demands to George Washington for his surrender, but Washington didn't agree. When the American troops started to prepare for another attack, Cornwallis agreed to Washington's terms, and the battle was over. On October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis signed the British surrender. The document was called the Articles of Capitulation. Capitulation means like giving up. Okay, so in these 3 paragraphs, we have quite a bit about the French helping the Americans, and especially for like Paulina, who's doing her propaganda poster project about the French helping the Americans. She might find her interesting fact there, and that's just fine. For me, the interesting fact is that Cornwallis didn't want to just surrender to, completely. He made a lot of demands. So Cornwallis tried to make demands when he surrendered. My question, maybe you can guess it, what were his demands? What did he want? Did he want to say, okay, we will give up, but you have to, give us all a nice stay in a hotel or something like that? And then, I had to pause and think, what else could I say about this fact? What else did it make me think of? And I kept thinking back to other wars. So this reminds me of other wars that ended in surrender, like, the World Wars, where famously in World War I, the Allies required a whole lot of things of Germany that left Germany poor and angry and kind of set up the world for World War II. So maybe demands at the end of a war aren't a good thing. Okay, let's keep going. So Cornwallis surrenders. British done fighting. Around 8,000 British troops surrendered in Yorktown. Although this wasn't all of the army, it was a big enough force to cause the British to start thinking that they were going to lose the war. Losing this battle made them start to think about peace and that it wasn't worth the cost of the war to keep the colonies. This opened the door for the Treaty of Paris. And if you're wondering why it's called the Treaty of Paris, when Paris is all the way over in France, it's because that's where the Americans and the British met up to sign a peace agreement. It was a safe place that was outside of the war. Interesting facts about the Battle of Yorktown. General Cornwallis said he was sick and didn't show up to surrender. He sent General Charles O'Hara to surrender his sword. The British tried to surrender to the French, but they made the British surrender to the Americans. In this battle between the French, Americans, and the British, nearly 1/3 of the soldiers were Germans. There were thousands on each side. The French forces were led by the Comte de Rochambeau. Some of the American forces were led by the Marquis de Lafayette, a French officer who became a major general in the American army. The British Prime Minister, Lord Frederick North, resigned after the British defeat and surrender at Yorktown. The battle lasted around 20 days. The American and French had around 18,000 troops, significantly outnumbering the 8,000 troops of the British. The British leader, General Cornwallis, was expecting to get reinforcements from the British Navy. When the French defeated the British Navy and prevented them from sending help, Cornwallis knew he was going to lose the battle. And this is a pretty good map. You could probably get some questions and thoughts from this map, but that's not what we're going to do. I looked at this section, and while there's a lot of interesting facts here, this part at the top caught my attention, and it kind of makes sense that this part that's part of the story of the battle would have a more important part than the extra facts right at the end. So my fact was, the British government felt that fighting wasn't worth it. And, I typed out the whole question. How do British people feel about the war now? I know some British friends. I should ask them, hey, do you guys care? Do you think about the American war very much? How is it taught in your schools? And finally, these days, the UK has a legal way for places to separate peacefully. So after these wars and after various things with countries trying to go independent, the UK now has laws where if one country wants to leave, they can. That's why a few years ago they had a big vote about Scotland leaving the UK, because they're set up for that to happen peacefully now. Thank you guys for watching. Today your your assignment is to read Lesson 1 of Chapter 6 in your Social Studies books. It goes from page 188 to page 193. And I want you to find 3 facts and then 3 questions and 3 responses. All right,